Now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening and welcome to Repro Action's March Act and Learn webinar. Tonight our topic is Getting Progressive Allyship Right. Here are your hosts. The first voice you hear speaking is me, Erin Matson. I'm one of the co-founders and co-directors of Repro Action. I'm based in Arlington, Virginia.
And I am Pamela Merritt, and the other co-founder, co-director of Repro Action, and I'm based in St. Louis, Missouri.
Great. Do you want to take us through the agenda, Pamela?
I do. Actually, Erin, I'm having trouble seeing the PowerPoint presentation on my end.
Oh, thank you very much for that. Does that resolve the problem?
It does. It does.
Thank you so much. Well, just quick, I'm going to go back and review so everyone can see our faces. That's Erin and Pamela. Hello. Thank you, Pamela. There's the agenda for you.
Fantastic. So going through the agenda, so we're going to do a quick introduction of who we are at Repro Action, and then we're going to go over what an ally is, and dive right into some tips and suggestions for how to be a better ally, and some like a basic overview of best practices for being a better ally, and then tips and suggestions. And then to round out the evening, the hour, we're going to go through next steps, and then we're going to have Q&A. Throughout the process of this webinar, we strongly encourage you to drop comments in with questions or suggestions, or even just if you want to share an example that you've experienced of good allyship or allyship gone wrong. We would love to see those dropped into the comments, and we will read them out loud. We also strongly encourage that you tweet throughout this webinar and share this information with your friends and followers on Twitter. The hashtag for live tweeting tonight is ReproAction. So Repro Action is a new direct action group that formed to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We are proud of our left flank analysis. We have a willingness to hold folks on all sides accountable, whether they are allies or opposition. And we also have a commitment to nonviolent direct action. Take it away, Erin.
All right. So just to get us started, what does being an ally mean to you? I'd love to have you type your answer in the question chat box, and I'd love to read off what folks think. What does an ally mean to you? The next slide will define it how we see it at Repro Action, but would love to get some examples from the group. So allyship. What does it mean? Oh, y'all are so quiet. Oh, there we go. Yay. So Alex says, allyship means using what I have, things like privilege, resources, etc., to help others. So that's great. That's a personal definition of how Alex sees being an ally. We've got Katie, who I will reveal is our campaign lead. She's wonderful. She says, knowing when to sit down and listen, but also when to amplify the voices of other people who are marginalized. That's an awesome definition, Katie. All right, Morgan says, being an ally means being open to productive and challenging engagement. A willingness to step outside my comfort zone. I love that theme of challenging engagement and stepping outside of comfort zone. I mean, that is exactly what allyship looks like in action. I'm going to leave it open for another moment or two, in case anyone also wants to chime in. Feel free to keep typing if you're already going, and I'll read it out as I go on to the next slide of how we define it at Repro Action. So what is an ally? An ally is a person who joins with another person or group in order to give support. Allies are people who recognize the unearned privilege they receive from society's patterns of injustice and take responsibility for changing these patterns. Ally is a verb. It's something you have to do. It's something you have to be consciously aware of. And just to define privilege, it's a special right or advantage available only to a particular person or group of people. And just to dig into this a little more, just because you have some areas of privilege doesn't mean that your life is perfect or that you don't necessarily face other disadvantages. So for example, me, I am a white woman. I am cisgender. I am straight presenting. I am, in fact, married to a man. And I have access to economic resources. So I am someone with a lot of privilege, even though I can also say at the same time that I face oppression as a woman. So it's so I just call that out because I hear sometimes people say when they're getting started, like, oh, how could I possibly have privilege because I face discrimination as a woman? So therefore, the idea of privilege applying to me is absurd, and that's simply not the case. There are a number of other ways that a person can have privilege. For example, able-bodied privilege, class privilege, education privilege, or having degrees or titles. I'd love, again, to get the conversation rolling here. So my next question is for the group: why is having allies important in the struggle for reproductive justice? And Pamela, to put you, my dear, on the spot, why is it important, as folks are starting to type in, why is it important to have allies in the struggle for reproductive justice?
I love that question. I think it's something that I definitely think about, and it's evolved in my thinking. But where I currently am is that it's important to have allies because reproductive justice is at its core an intersectional movement, and so it's important that we are bringing people into the movement who represent core areas of oppression, and that we are lifting that up in a way that also has power that comes from the voice of people who are of those communities. And I also think it's important to have allies so that people can go into their areas and their communities and preach the gospel of reproductive justice, so that they can take back what they learned from our movement and amplify it to an audience that might not have heard of reproductive justice or how it's different from traditional reproductive rights movement.
That's great, Pamela. We're getting an answer from Constance why having allies is important in the struggle for reproductive justice. And Constance says, because no one entity can win alone, because we are not one issue people. Life is complex. Our movements should be also. Ooh, I love that. Our movements should be complex. And the more blurry that we get, the more that we try to untangle how oppression works, it is going to be increasingly uncomfortable for a number of people to do the work. I often tell myself that if I'm not feeling challenged every day in my privilege, that I'm not doing the work I need to do in order to be effective to help move this movement forward. So I really, really appreciate that from Constance. And then I'm also going to ask, why is being an ally important to you? And encourage anyone to type in with that. I'll say for me, I find it very important to be an ally because personally, not only is it about growing myself and growing in the work and impact that I can do, I also see firsthand how people who don't possess the same level of privilege that I do are frankly shit on much more than I am. And these are my friends, and some are not my friends, and that's also my job too. So I just see it as critical. If I really want to walk the social justice walk, it means um, actively working to support and elevate the leadership of others.
You
Any
here.
answers on this, on why being an ally is important to you, Pamela? Anything you want to weigh in with from your lens?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I think about one of the most important ally roles that I play is as uh, with my brother, and who is autistic, and he's my older brother. He's the oldest in my family, and I've spent a lot of time um, working through, what my role is, and how I can be an ally to him and to his community, and how I can learn from that. And I really went through an evolution that I got just from being an ally, from trying to speak for my brother to realizing that I needed to really turn inward to talk to people who don't necessarily have a person with autism in their life, or themselves do not have autism, so that they can better understand why I am an activist more than just a sibling. So it was a awesome learning experience, and I grew so much as a person just through that participation of being an ally. And I've learned the power of kind of listening, and not trying to take over and make everything perfect in my personal definition of what perfect would be, but to listen to what folks like my brother actually want and need. And that's a powerful lesson that has paid off in so many areas of my life.
That's profound. Thank you for sharing that, Pamela, and especially for sharing something so deeply personal and important to you on so many levels. I'm gonna jump in with Morgan's comments on why being an ally is important to them. And I think from there we'll likely move on to your tips about being a better ally. So Morgan's comment is, I think I am still learning to be an effective ally. I love, thank you, Morgan, for being honest too about the learning process. That's rich. To echo Erin, as a privileged white cisgendered person, I need to do my own work and not reinscribe that privilege. It is a daily struggle to contest my own internal narrative and question where my prejudices come from. And I just want to let you know, Morgan, that I've got my praise fingers up at the screen for you for talking about the daily struggle. This is something that, Pamela and I were recently in a training together and had a long conversation with the entire group about privilege. And I remember discussing in that group how important it is to, work on these issues every single day, and think about privilege every single day, if we want to be effective in this movement. So with that, I'm going to pass it along to Pamela.
Thank you very much. So let's go through. It's actually a perfect segue to what we're going to go through as far as some best practices or some guiding principles on how to be a better ally. So that inner work that Morgan described is probably the most important step to being a good ally, and particularly within progressive movement spaces, it's the thing that is most lacking. So just to keep it real, as we do here at Repro Action, the first thing you need to do is ask yourself why you are identifying as an ally. That's a question that people who are active in movement work on progressive side to the left often don't ask, because we are so used to being motivated by our better angels. We're motivated by being part of the cause, and that you need to dig deeper and actually do the inner work to unpack what Morgan was talking about, to unpack your privilege, to unpack your motivation, and to really figure out whether or not you're an ally, or are you making an allegiance for a strategic political purpose that is different. That's not being an ally. That's the strategery of politics that that often ends up creating, the bridges that get burnt down in our movement work. So I strongly encourage, and a lot of the resources that I've gone through in preparing for this presentation encourage that you do that inner work and ask yourself why you feel that you identify as an ally to the group or to the cause, the campaign that you are interested in participating in. So I'm going to pause here for a second, and if people have questions about that kind of process, or if they want to share, any process of inner work or questions that they've asked themselves before stepping into or leaning into movement work, I would really appreciate and would love to hear from you. While we wait for that, Erin, if you want to share, what process or what questions you might ask yourself before you step up and go attend an event or a meeting or identify yourself as an ally.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's really something where I go through a different series of questions, often depending on what a particular event is. First of all, I think and ask to myself, is this a place where I want to be visibly present, where I should be visibly present, or is the best way that I can help in other words, as a direct participant or as someone who is supporting in some other way, right? Because the thing is, for example, the truth is that as a white person, if I walk into a number of spaces, just me being present changes the nature of the space for others. And so is that helpful to others or not? Another question that I ask myself is, what can I do to make sure that I am elevating the voices and leadership of others? And in particular, something that I often focus on is, what can I do to help raise the volume of the softer voices in the room? And I mean that both directly, but also more metaphorically, that as someone who identifies strongly as a cultural feminist, I want to make sure that that I am doing my part to help draw in the contributions of everyone, including people who are often not put front and center. So that's another piece that I think about. And again, it's a case by case issue. What is my role? What can I do most effectively to help? And certainly, if I think that helping is something beyond beyond supporting, whether it's through money or infrastructure resources, or using whatever platform I already have to help shine a light on someone else's. Anything that goes into the turf of I can help someone that isn't acknowledging their leadership already in solving the problems that directly affect them is something that we need to step back and take a look at and say, maybe not.
Good stuff. Thank you for sharing that. That's all great advice. So we have, I believe it's a question from Jay. So what are some considerations for an ally to keep in mind when they cross paths with a member of a marginalized group who has reactionary views? A pro-choice man encountered an anti-choice woman, for instance, or white anti-racist talking with someone like Ben Carson or Sheriff David Clark. That's interesting. So I think the most important consideration an ally should have is that you do not speak for the group. So you can share your personal views, but you can't speak on behalf of any one group. A great lesson in this, actually, I learned, I used to blog a lot, and I would often blog about my brother. And so I would talk about, you know, my experiences as a guardian, where my sister and I have co-guardianship with my brother, and kind of what it's like to navigate the process. Or I'd share a story, and it was somebody took a blog post of mine and they shared it with within a space that was curated by people who have autism, and they were not at all thrilled with the tone that I had taken. And when I had a sentence in there where I talked about autism as if I've always had autism in my life, and they definitely were offended by that. So I received all these comments, and I'm thinking, whoa, where's this coming from? And I was particularly alarmed because these were people who have autism, and I was like, oh my God, I've really stepped in it. But I went through, I stepped back, took a deep breath, took a long walk, and then I went back and I reread it, and I realized if I put my personal identities into the context, that would have greatly offended me. So I apologized formally in the post, and said that, you know, I appreciated the teachable moment, because no matter how intimately I might feel that my life has been with communities that with people who have autism, I do not have autism. So I cannot speak with that voice. So I think that's a very important consideration. And I felt like it was an incredible learning moment for me. As a Black woman, I probably would have absolutely gone off if somebody had done the same through a race lens or through a gender lens. So it was a great teachable moment, and I think back to that very often. The other thing is that when people are very fixed in their position, that's not necessarily the person that you need to be trying to have some sort of debate with. If you're talking to somebody who's just waiting for you to finish talking before they can get in their view, that's not a discussion, that's an exchange of talking points. So what I'm going to assume that what you mean by reactionary views is that this is somebody who, like, if it's Ben Carson, you know, and I don't know Ben Carson, but what the media Ben Carson that we do know, then this is somebody who is very fixed, has very clear views, and so as an ally, you have to go through the process that Erin kind of laid out. Like, what is my role here? What benefit does this moment have in me speaking up to this person? But also that you are not speaking on behalf of the group. You are an ally. And so it might just be one of those things where you have to listen and process. Or if the opportunity does seem right, that you make sure that you are framing your discussion as an ally, and as in not claiming that you can speak on behalf or educate on behalf of the group. I hope that answers your question, Jay. So to move along, the other things that are pretty good best practices in life, as well as in being a good ally, is number 2, listen and learn. Listening is one of the hardest things for me to do, but it is the most, it pays off the most in my life. So as I was talking earlier about having to take a walk in order to process the critique and the feedback that I got on a post about my brother, that was so that I could listen and then learn. So when you are going into a space as an ally, that is not an opportunity for, it's not a sharing circle. It's not an opportunity for you to talk about why you're there, as much as it's an opportunity for you to listen to why the space exists. and to listen and figure out and learn how people communicate and how people honor and respect the people who created that space. So listening and learning are key to being a good ally. Listening is probably the most powerful tool that you can take into any space as an ally. The other thing, number 3, is to help open up spaces without taking them over. So that's part of the listening. So you're not going in to say, I am really passionate about Black Lives Matter, and I'm a white ally, and I'm going to come in here and teach you how to deal with the media. That's like not cool. So you want to listen, learn, and then take that learning to help open up spaces and use your privilege and your power as an ally, whatever that might be, to open up spaces without taking them over. So you want to, as Erin was talking about, you want to maybe ask somebody who hasn't spoken what they think. You want to encourage somebody to share, or be that person who helps amplify a softer voice in the room. So literally opening up the space of those who are attending, so that you're basically, that is movement work, because you're helping that person amplify and add their voice, but you're not trying to be their voice. Another important thing, number 4, is to do your research. I cannot say this enough. When Erin and I were at a training the other week, and we, as Erin said, we had an entire, I think it was more than an hour, where we dedicated time to talking about privilege, and particularly as organizers for social justice. And one of the folks had an interaction where they were like basically asking a bunch of clarifying questions, and they weren't taking that opportunity to think, well, is this something that I can demand of the other people in the circle to answer for me? That is a power move, and that's a flex of privilege that usually is not very welcome, and it definitely is not a good sign of an ally. Do your research, and then as you listen and learn, there will be opportunities for you to clarify or ask questions about the research that you're doing. But the people who are attending are not there to educate you about oppression. They are not there to educate you about, the history of LGBTQ inequality and oppression or anything. So this is on you to do your research. The internet is a beautiful thing. And you can certainly ask, what resources you might recommend, and so forth, but people aren't professors in the space. And a good ally does that research and then comes into the space and builds on it. So at this time, I would like to pause again. So if you have questions about research and what to do or not to do when you're doing research about a social justice issue or about oppression, we're more than happy to answer those as much as we can. And also, if you have any suggestions about, or examples of when you've done research, feel free to drop those into the comments or the question section as well. So, Erin, do you have any examples, or have you ever been faced with a situation where you did research before just to build up and become a better ally?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, Pamela, because one of the things that I've been digging into in inner work over the past year is making sure that I'm not using people with less privilege as myself as education tools, if that makes sense. In other words, approaching spaces and making sure that I'm not going to learn everything, teach me about cisgender privilege, or teach me about white privilege, when it's work that I need to start doing on my own to learn basic terms. What do they mean? That people, so not expecting people who live identities that are at the center of a particular storm need to explain to me basic terminology that I can look up on the web.
Yep. Yep. That's a great piece of advice, and exactly what I was talking about. So just to move along, so number 5 is you want to look for appropriate opportunities to amplify, not overshadow. So you definitely don't want to walk around taking, some video of yourself in the space talking about how cool it is to be, marching because somebody was shot in the street. That I'd certainly seen it done, but that's not amplifying that action. That's putting yourself and centering yourself in the action. It's easy to do because it is exciting to take action in the struggle for social justice. I don't know a single person who hasn't felt that adrenaline rush, but as an ally, it's important that you amplify the action and that you amplify the message behind the action. So when I walk away from an event or a march or a demonstration, and I look at my social media feed, I am looking for how many times I said I, and I'm looking for, how many times I centered myself versus centering that the mission for that action and amplifying the statement that we're trying to send with that action. And I have scored several Ds, and then of late I've been doing better. But I definitely, when I first started kind of using social media to amplify direct action, I was putting myself at the center of it. And more, as I've kind of explored why the heck am I out here walking down this street for 3 hours, then I realized that this is an opportunity to communicate to the world why I'm out there, and not communicate to the world that I'm out there walking. And I hope that finite difference comes across. But definitely as an ally, you're amplifying not just to the core group that is participating in an event, but when you amplify, you are amplifying and educating, and it's an opportunity to educate your circle of friends, your circle of acquaintances who may not have any idea what's going on, but it matters to them that somebody they know is participating. It matters to them that somebody they know is sharing the message. So that is a powerful move to do as an ally, and definitely should center the work and the mission and the message and not center yourself. Number 6 is make a commitment to use inclusive language. This is a personal to do. It's my yearly renewable New Year's resolution, which is to use inclusive language. And it's a work in progress. So, but I definitely work very hard to make sure that I am using language that is respectful and inclusive. And a couple of things to look out for that I've been guilty of is ableist language that basically is mocking or dismissing people who have disabilities, or or language that wrongly misgenders people, or assumes identities that might not necessarily be how that person identifies themselves. This number 6 is not an excuse to step away and not participate. Number 6 is an opportunity to grow. And as somebody who has tripped over this in many different ways, I can honestly say that my tripping has been met with correction, clarification, but never humiliation. So when I'm in progressive spaces and I'm working hard on using inclusive language, that I have not had anybody basically show me the door. And I think that's not an excuse not to go and participate and be a part of our wonderfully rich and diverse political left, but it definitely means that to be a better ally, we need to work harder to lead by example. And if we're asking the broader world to do progressive things, then we need to ask it of ourselves first. Erin, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
You are rocking this, my dear. I just have awe and appreciation to you right now.
Oh, hey, all right. That's a good thing. So I'll just move along. And again, if you have comments or if you want to add an example of when you've been the subject of somebody not using inclusive language, or if you have suggestions on some inclusive language that people might want to work on using, please feel free to add that into the questions. I'm going to move along, but I will certainly share that if it pops up. So number 7 is apologize without caveats. I have this weird interest in apologies. I'm always looking when somebody trips over something and they say, well, I'm sorry if you are offended. Or they'll say, you know, I'm sorry that my words were misinterpreted. You know, when you apologize, you need to apologize, and it needs to be a sincere, full-throated apology. So when I apologized for using kind of first-person language when discussing people with autism, when I myself don't have autism, I said I was sorry, that I was wrong, and that I completely understand why they were offended, and I hope that they forgive me and understand that this was an incredibly learning experience, but that I definitely acknowledge that I was wrong. I didn't dive into a whole explanation of why they shouldn't be offended because I'm a really good person and I have a rescue dog. I didn't get into all of that stuff. It doesn't matter. Apologizing without caveats is what makes you a better ally. And that's another example of leading by example. Because if we're going to ask the broader community and the broader world to apologize for years of oppression and violence, neglect, and abuse, and we don't want a caveat from them, then we need to do the same and practice what we preach, and do the same within progressive spaces. And number 8 is show up, step back. So you want to be there, you want to be present, and you want to live up to your commitment. So if you say you're going to be someplace, if you say you're going to be at an event or at a march or at a demonstration, be there. But step back. You don't need to be at the front of the march. You don't need to be the person who is on every shot at CNN at 3 o'clock in the morning. You don't need to be the most tweeted picture unless that just happened to happen. But don't center yourself, but that doesn't mean you don't show up. You're still showing up because you're an ally and you've got the back of every single person who's out there demonstrating for a cause that you've committed yourself to. But you step back and make sure that you're centering the people who are directly impacted by the oppression or whatever issue you are there to deal with, address, demonstrate for. All right, Erin, can we go to the next slide?
Let's do it.
All right, this one's you.
I just have to laugh because Pamela put this PowerPoint together, and when I saw this slide, it's rich. So something that's incumbent on everyone to do, but especially people with privilege, is to speak up if a space lacks diversity. And one of the reasons why I was chuckling about this image is some of you on this call may know that in my copious spare time, I run a Tumblr called White Guys Doing It By Themselves, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's It's a Tumblr of white men doing everything, whether it's panels or media or government or business or you name it, ribbon cutting ceremonies in local towns by the harbor. I've got something of everything up there. But the point is really, I want to lean into this a little more because the point is really deep and profound. Diversity is not simply just making sure that you don't have 5 white guys sitting at a table, although that in itself is something to be corrected. Diversity needs to be in strategy, in decision making, in power. There is a difference within organizations, within organizing, within campaigns of having people of color or queer people or people who might be in a minority within the context of a given group invited to attend, of having, one friend, for instance. And there's a difference between that and sharing power and sharing strategy and sharing resources. And so, honestly, when you look at a number of progressive organizations, even organizations that call themselves progressive, if their leadership is not diverse, it doesn't, I don't think it should be considered acceptable if their junior staff is more diverse. So it's really about power, and it's incumbent on us to speak up if a space lacks diversity. It's important, as a white person, I try very actively to make sure that if I am invited to be on a panel, if I notice that it's all white people, for instance, I will speak up. You also have to be willing to walk, as someone who's also served on a number of boards. I repeatedly serve as a pest when to call out if our board is not diverse. And honestly, you have to be willing to walk as well. Part of doing this work is not being complicit in the erasure and exclusion of others. So yeah, that's one piece. And if folks have questions or comments or thoughts about or examples of speaking up if a space lacks diversity, I sure welcome you to put that in. Otherwise, I'm going to keep moving along because we're actually getting closer to our Q&A time. So this is my other tip is discussing your activism, and not just your activism, but your views and a dignity and justice perspective with friends and family. One of the toughest things for a number of activists and progressives to realize that actually the most difficult work you may have to do as a progressive, and if you're being effective, is not simply marching down the street with a banner or telling an oppressive politician or demanding or making it impossible for them to keep trampling on others' rights. That some of the most important work that we have to do as activists and as allies is doing that work with the people closest to us who maybe could care less about protests that happen on a street, or even maybe have never signed an online action alert in their life. But standing up to your friends and families, and frankly, your colleagues and people who are in your network who are willing to listen to you when they say a racist joke, when they say that there's no such thing as white privilege, when they make dismissive comments about transgender people. Actually, the most profound work that we can do as allies is to get our own people and talk to the people who will listen to us, who will at least hear us. They may not agree with us. They may ridicule us. They may be quite hostile to us for doing it, but they are far more likely to listen to us than they are to listen to the group that someone who belongs to the group that they're disparaging. And so I can't underscore this enough. I'd also just add as a tip that that, you know, a lot of conversations happen these days on social media, and that's great. But when you see folks, you know, on your Facebook feed, for instance, who are sharing comments that are racist or sexist or ableist or classist, that getting into a Facebook war may not be the most productive way to make it safe for them to change their mind. Oftentimes, when people are performing publicly, they're not going to back down. In fact, they're more likely to keep digging in their heels when others are watching. I have actually had it the case before where someone was engaged in a long Facebook thread, and many people were trying to talk sense into her, and she continued to dig in her heels. And I approached her through private messages and asked if she'd be willing to do a phone call with me. And we did actually an hour-long phone conversation discussing why it was offensive that she said that she wanted to laugh every time she heard the phrase white privilege, because she had experienced class-based oppression and sex-based oppression in her life, and just didn't think it was fair to conflate her with bankers in Wall Street. And so anyway, my point with this, which I can't underscore enough, if there's anything that you take away from what I've shared on this webinar tonight, I hope it's that you will find a way to think about the next time folks in your personal network make disparaging comments, what you will do to approach them in a conversation that is one where not only are you holding firm about what's right and wrong, but also that you're making it safe for them to change and grow. Because that's the whole point of this work, is change and growth, not labeling people good or bad and tossing them aside forever. Although you may well decide that you need to take a break from people for your sanity and safety, and that's not what I'm talking about. That's great, but you want to make sure that you're spreading the message of dignity, equality, and justice. And the way that you do that is not simply by being right or righteous, it's by making it safe for others to change. So with that, I'll pass it back to Pamela.
Hear, hear. So the final tip is to one of my favorite pictures. It is activist Bree Newsome climbing that pole in South Carolina that took down the Confederate flag. What I love about this is that Bree Newsome didn't approach that flag alone. Bree Newsome was there with the gentleman you see at the bottom, who is within the fenced-in area and has the kind of construction special vest on. So I think a lot of people know who Bree Newsome is, but a lot of people don't know who James Stone is. And that's actually the sign of a brilliant action. I love the fact that that Bree was put in front to explain why she took this action, that she, has been front and center in almost every discussion about the removal of the Confederate flag, and that it always centered her, and that James was a fantastic ally because he had her back. He was there to make sure that she was able to scale the flagpole and execute the action, but also had her back in the fact that this was not about James. This was about Bree and about the symbol of the Confederate flag and all of the reasons why she went up there and took it down. So this is just a fantastic example of solid allyship, of being there and making sure that this message got across. And I think this is probably one of the most profound actions, direct actions for racial justice that I have witnessed in a long time. So it was beautifully executed, and I think a wonderful example of a really solid, awesome ally and a brave, fierce warrior for justice. Oh, one more. Show up, which we've talked about before, but we can't say enough. So you totally, absolutely must show up. As we talk about how to be a better ally, and we talk about kind of the inner work that you need to do, we are still advocates and activists for social justice. We must be present as we go through this learning experience. So whether you're new and worried about whether to be a good ally, or you've been doing this for a long time and are now thinking about whether or not you might have tripped over some wires and maybe rethinking some experiences that didn't go so well, we still must show up, because oppression isn't going anywhere, and unless we show up, take action, and tear it down. So we have to be there, and the tips that we went through tonight are all just wonderful best practices and reminders to help us kind of brush over, if we're seasoned activists, our work, and make sure that we're showing up in the space the way we want to. And if you're new to activism and are just interested in how to approach spaces, this is a wonderful way to kind of think through and get yourself ready to go in and be a great ally. Either way, gotta show up.
Thanks, Pamela. So this is our shameless self-promotion hour now. So please plug into Repro Action campaigns. If you're not already on our email list, that is the best way to make sure you don't miss a single thing. You can sign up at www.reproaction.org. You want to sign up because we've got an amazing campaign coming soon. So I want to make sure you don't miss it. Follow us on social media. We're Repro Action on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Get out that calendar and mark it now, because abortion is coming to the Supreme Court. It has already come in the case of Whole Woman's Health v. Hellerstedt. There were oral arguments at the beginning of this month. We're going to be drilling deeper into that case and what's at stake and what could happen, and lots of other exciting things we'll have to talk about next April. So we hope that you'll join us on Tuesday, April 19th. It'll be from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern. Again, the very best way to make sure you get the invite to that is to sign up for our alerts at reproaction.org. I hope to see every single one of you there, because it's going to be so cool. Can't wait. And with that, I'll pass it back to Pamela.
Awesome. So we have a few minutes left for any additional Q&A. So I know we took questions and comments throughout this webinar, but if you had something you wanted to add or a question that you wanted to ask and didn't get a chance to, now is the time to drop that into the question section of your GoToWebinar panel, and we will certainly take that off. So while we wait, so I'm trying to think of a good question that I haven't already asked.
So can I ask you a question, Pamela?
Of course you can.
All right. So how do we move past one of the ways that privilege often rears its head in activist spaces is people are well-meaning, I believe, and they all come together and say, let's talk about privilege. And then it turns into the people who possess more privilege saying, going on the defensive, and it becomes about them personally and their feelings. What's a great way to get out of that so that the conversation isn't derailed?
Gosh, that's a good question. So I think it's hard once it spirals into that. It's very hard to back it up, but I've certainly done that myself. And I think when people get defensive when they get their back up, I usually I start to talk slower and softer. And I like to recenter and remind the person I'm talking to that this is not a personal attack. That what I'm talking about are systems of oppression, and that, you know, unpacking where you sit there is a whole separate conversation. So I've certainly had it happen in curious spaces. I had it happen when I was talking. I was at a meeting to go over like abortion funds, and we were talking about privilege, and somebody was, you know, their back went up and they were greatly offended by the way we were talking about people with money, and I could tell that that was a very sensitive subject, but at the same time, I think we were able to circle back around to the fact that we all showed up there to talk about abortion funds. So, and that money is obviously an issue when we're talking about how people can't access abortion because of a lack of funds and the hurdles that are placed between them and care. So we were able to kind of redirect the conversation. But one of the things that I've learned through bad conversation mistakes is how to not get personal, to be, you know, not make it a personal indictment to begin with. And that can that's basically, how did you shape the conversation, or how did you shape the statement? You know, and if you want to take it there, then fine. But if you start off a conversation saying rich people suck, the rich person in the room might get their back up. And that might not be what you're there to talk about. If you're trying to talk about abortion funds, then, you know, some rich people might be good to have in the room. So I hope that answers your question. We do have a question from Morgan. Do you have any suggestions on organizations that repro rights justice activists might engage with as allies? That's a great question. Erin, you want to take that first?
Yes. So one area that I think repro rights and justice organizations or activists might engage with as allies, and I want to be clear that this is not separate from reproductive rights and justice. That it's intertwined, and reproductive rights and justice applies in these spaces as well. But two that I want to lift up as areas where those of that mind would be great to engage is within disability rights organizations, and specifically women with disabilities. There's often a presumption that women with disabilities and people with disabilities are not sexual. There are enormous barriers to care, and there's been a history of mistrust between the movements, and I think that there's that's an area where it's really great to do the collaboration. I will give a plug for Women Enabled International is a great organization. I love them, that works on women and disability. I think another area, you know, as we look at, there are bills flying around the country right now at the state level. The radical right is targeting transgender people, especially transgender children in schools, with these terrible bathroom bills. And it seems incumbent on the feminist community and the reproductive health rights and justice community to really step up and say, no, not in our name. And that's something that, you know, from a feminist perspective, I would love to see more explicit women's and feminist organizations taking on that banner. Because the way that we're going to get out of this is all together, and we shouldn't allow ourselves to be pitted against one another by the right.
Hear, hear. So we just have one final comment from Katie. I found that sometimes having everyone take a breath and then also reinforce that while it's natural to feel upset or defensive sometimes, the stakes that people with less privilege face can be higher than hurt feelings. And that's Katie's advice. If you're faced with somebody who has their back up and that conversation's derailing, I think that's fantastic advice. And taking a deep breath and kind of taking a step back and then stepping back and kind of refocusing on why you're there in the first place, that's fantastic advice for kind of how to diffuse those situations. So with that, we are at 7, and we do like to end on time. So I will go ahead and thank Erin for awesome advice and great questions. And thank you everybody for attending. And we look forward to seeing you in the streets or on our next webinar in April. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Pamela.
Thank you, Erin. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.